All right, so I'm going to talk to you guys actually about two studies today. The first one involved a naturalistic on-road observation study that we conducted with MIT. We had 14 drivers who participated in this study. These people drove a Tesla Model 3 2020 year model as their personal vehicle for a month. Now, what's important to know about these people is that they had no prior experience with Tesla vehicles or Tesla's autopilot before their participation in this study. The second study was actually a survey of vehicle owners who have partially automated systems, so level 2 driving automation, in their vehicles and who regularly use those systems in their vehicles. And these vehicle owners fell into one of three categories. The first one involved GM owners of Super Cruise, Nissan ProPilot Assist owners, and Tesla Autopilot owners. But the first study, we want to really target the idea of how do drivers behave around partially automated safeguards. And the safeguards we were particularly interested in for this study involved driver monitoring, attention reminders, so interior sensing solutions and how they identify driver disengagement, and based on the presence or absence of certain behaviors, how the system then triggers alerts to get the driver to do something to adhere back to the driver requirements of the system. And then emergency escalation. Now, emergency escalation refers to the last resort countermeasures that partial automation systems often are equipped with. And these last resort countermeasures often take the form of a controlled vehicle slowdown and or lockout countermeasure. And the lockout countermeasure is literally when the driver is denied access to the automation for the rest of the drive. Now, the second study wanted to address the question of what does consumer acceptance actually look like among people who have firsthand experience with these safeguards. So the first study looked at, again, Tesla's autopilot system. And in this system, it is, at the time of the study, was largely torque-based in terms of its interior monitoring system of the driver. And the alerts could be canceled by the driver, either with the driver moving the steering wheel, toggling the scroll wheels, as you can see here on the image next to the driver's thumbs, or engaging the wheel stalk. Now, Tesla's autopilot's attention reminder sequence has 4 general phases, and we identified this using the naturalistic observation data. But these 4 general phases share certain similarities and characteristics across different phases, but also incorporate an escalation component where the quality of the communication changes in its urgency as a function of time. So in the first phase, which we just called A1, in this phase, you had the gray icon of hands on the wheel and the instructions to apply slight turning force to the steering wheel. And then once that phase finished, A2, the second phase, involved similar iconography, but the hands were actually red on that gray steering wheel. And it also corresponded with a bimodal alert with an audible single tone pulse. The third stage of the escalation sequence has the same visual iconography, but the audible component becomes a 2-tone pulse burst. The last sequence, or the last phase of the sequence, which we called A4, is sort of when you see those last resort countermeasures activated. A4 corresponds with this large red icon in the center of the display. The instructions have changed. Now the driver is notified that auto steer functionality is no longer available, and the driver has to resume control for the rest of the drive. This also corresponds with a continuous audible tone burst, and as soon as you see this large steering wheel icon appear, that is when the controlled slowdown countermeasure begins. And as soon as that slowdown begins, the driver will be locked out from autopilot for the rest of the drive. Now, in terms of the escalation sequences we observed, we actually found that autopilot is very nuanced in terms of how it communicates with the driver. It uses a lot of information around the vehicle, as well as what's happening inside the vehicle, and also incorporating history of how it interacted with the driver earlier in the trip. We saw, in general, these different sequences, and so sometimes you saw autopilot go through the 4 different phases sequentially. Sometimes it bypassed phases. And this was, again, a component of system determination of whether urgency for faster response was necessary. And anyway, at the end of the day, though, for the purpose of our analyses, we separated the data based on A1 only alerts, and that typically happens when the driver is responding very quickly, because those are the initial alerts that very quickly get interrupted, and then all the other alerts. So all the other escalated alerts fell into that category of escalated sequences. This is what the epoch structure looked like. Because this is naturalistic observation data, we had synchronized video data, CAN data, GPS data, and the epochs surrounded the actual alert sequences. So 10 seconds leading up to the alert sequence, the whole duration of the alert sequence, and then 10 seconds afterwards. So that is what each epoch surrounding an alert event looked like. And what we found that in general, interestingly, attention reminder events don't seem to discourage autopilot use. We didn't see a relationship in terms of the cumulative number of attention reminders and the cumulative number of miles traveled with autopilot in use. But we did see changes in behavior as a function of time. We specifically saw that if you look at the rate of alerts, A1 only alerts become a lot more frequent as time goes on, whereas escalated alert sequences become less frequent as time goes on. And this also corresponded with duration. We also saw that A1 only, so this is again the initial alerts, they became much shorter as a function of time, whereas the escalated sequence events that we saw did not really change meaningfully as a function of time. And that makes sense, because remember, a lot of different sequences fall into this particular bucket, and so there's a lot of noise. There's also much longer periods of driver behavior around the alert events as well, contributing to that noise. So one thing we did not expect to see in this study was many lockout events. As I mentioned before, when the vehicle performs that emergency slowdown countermeasure and locks out driver access, that's a very extreme last resort countermeasure that only occurs when the attention reminder sequence has been exhausted. And so the fact that we saw 4 out of 14 drivers have these lockout events, and so we saw 16 lockout events in total, and moreover, one person actually had 12 lockout events during the course of their month's participation. This really shows that although this might be a minority of drivers, some people genuinely do need these last resort countermeasures. And also, one thing that's important to note that we're going to talk about a little bit more in a moment is the idea that after the lockout event occurred, we actually saw some drivers try to reactivate the system afterwards, which shows that there's clearly some misunderstanding about the lockout countermeasure, cause and effect, and how it in fact impacts their role as a driver and their relationship with the automation. So, diving a little bit more deeply into the behavior that we saw around these systems, or around autopilot specifically, and this is something that we've seen with other studies as well, but autopilot, again, being a torque steer, hand-on-wheel monitoring-based system, obviously drivers are supposed to keep their hands on the wheel. But if we looked at the subset of data involving drivers having their hands off the wheel at the start of the alerts, so that's what's shown on the left side of this page. And we saw that drivers, over time, seem to respond by putting their hands on the wheel with the same general amount of reaction time, regardless of their time in the study. So in other words, people responded with the generally same speed to put their hands back on the wheel once the alerts started. However, once the alerts ended, people became a whole lot faster at taking their hands off of the wheel over time. And we're going to talk about how this relates to general activity in a while. But I just want to talk about this a little bit more, because if you look at other types of systems, this is not a Tesla-specific finding. This is something we have seen with other systems as well that are solely rely on steering torque or capacitive touch systems, and really just argue for the value of having multimodal solutions that are more holistic and more global in their interpretations of driver behavior, because this is an example of the type of behavior that we saw with an alert with respect to hands on wheel going on, so similar reaction time going onto the wheel, but then a whole lot faster taking your hands off the wheel once the alerts end. So this is with the Mercedes system, and again, it's a capacitive touch, or at this time steering torque-based sensor. And basically what happened was the driver got the alert, quickly put their hands on the wheel, nudged it, and then took their hand right off. And this was something very typical that we saw with a lot of these alerts, where the drivers got the hands on wheel alert, they nudged the wheel, and then immediately go back to doing what they were going to do. And they became a lot faster at taking their hands off the wheel as a result over time, once they internalized that driver requirement. Now, if we look at gaze around the attention reminder events themselves, we see that in general, drivers spend more time looking at the road. That's great. But during the alerts themselves, we saw that there was a trade-off between the amount of time they spent looking at the road and how much time they spent looking at the display. Now, in the Model 3, there's only one display in the vehicle cabin, and so that's where the visual iconography is being presented and so on. So it's not surprising that there is an attentional capture effect happening there. However, the fact is we saw people trade off their on-road glances to look at the display rather than trade off their off-road glance time to look at the display. And then once the alerts end, they go back to similar levels of on-road glance time. We also saw that over the whole time in their participation of the study, that people they spend less time looking at the forward roadway overall, but they also spend less time looking at the display. This is something we've seen in other studies, that people become they become more efficient after largely week one to internalize and learn the methods of communication that the vehicle uses to speak to the driver. They become more efficient at using that information to understand what's expected of them. And so that's not surprising that we see a drop in display glance time. But the fact that is we also saw there was a drop in on-road glance time as well, which is concerning because as a result there was an increase in off-road glance time as well. This is very much made sense of if you look at the secondary activities people were performing. Secondary activities refer to activities that people are doing that doesn't involve direct physical control of the vehicle. We can see that that driving unrelated activity was overall far more prevalent than driving-related activity. And also, we see that driving unrelated activity increases over time, whereas driving-related activity decreases over time. And so what we can take away from that is that people are really finding opportunities to do things that they're not supposed to do as they become familiar with the system and as they become familiar with the countermeasures that are equipped in that vehicle, especially if those countermeasures allow for quite a bit of time in between the different escalation phases. But let's now talk about how this relates to consumer acceptance. In general, when we kind of ask the question of why people are doing these non-driving related activities in their vehicles, in general, overwhelmingly, regardless of the automaker who made your vehicle, people generally hold the opinion that it is safer to do these highly distracting multitasking activities while using their automation than while driving without it. Likewise, people also think their multitasking ability improves when they're able to use the partial automation. And this is really, really characterized concerningly when we look at the false sense of security that people have around the role of partial automation and how its limitations may not necessarily translate into consumer understanding. Because in this slide that I'm showing here, we asked people how comfortable they were with letting the vehicle, their systems essentially drive without the driver, having to watch what's happening on the road. None of the partially automated systems, and partial automation by design, is supposed to be used this way. So this is extremely concerning, the fact that we're seeing such a high number of people holding this false sense of security. Fortunately, though, when we start thinking about safeguards to help people stay engaged in the driving, we're seeing that in general, there's not a whole lot of frustration being exhibited around attention reminders. There's quite a bit of tolerance people have around this, and more research is showing that this is definitely the case around partial automation. I want to emphasize this is not clear whether this tolerance translates into manual driving with respect to distraction mitigation. This tolerance might be specific to partial automation with that novelty and assistance effect. But the fact is, people do have quite a bit of tolerance around the attention reminders, and in general report not having a whole lot of frustration or annoyance even when they've had hands-on experience with these attention reminder events. Likewise, people in general are overwhelmingly supportive of having attention reminder countermeasures in their vehicles. Overwhelmingly, regardless of the different automaker group that we looked at, people in general felt that these countermeasures were very helpful and that they also felt much safer knowing that their vehicle was equipped with these countermeasures. But that's attention reminders. Let's talk now about vehicle lockout countermeasures, that last resort countermeasure that typically corresponds also with the vehicle slowdown. At the time of this study, only Super Cruise and Autopilot was equipped with the lockout countermeasure, so this doesn't involve the ProPilot Assist owners. But we asked people very simply, have you ever been driving and with your system and all of a sudden it was no longer available? And I know that's a very broad and vague question, but there's method to our madness here. We found that quite a few people said, yes, that had happened, but the understanding of why that happened was extremely mixed. When we asked people why they thought their system had suddenly become unavailable and they couldn't react it for the rest of the drive, there were a whole bunch of reasons why people said that that had happened. Many people attributed it to their secondary activities. Eating was a very common feature, and for some reason people are very clumsy when they drive, I guess, and a lot of people mentioned dropping their tacos or their hamburgers. And nevertheless, they said that that was the reason why their system escalated, and as a result, they experienced the lockout countermeasure. But other people attribute the lockout countermeasure to ODD restrictions and other system functionality boundaries. So there's clearly some miscommunication and misunderstanding, which is definitely re-emphasized looking at our Tesla data, where we saw the reactivation attempts once people were locked out. There's clearly some miscommunication and misunderstanding around the cause and effect purpose of those lockout countermeasures and how they relate to driver behavior overall. But when we asked people again about the frustration that they experienced in those system unavailable situations, we saw more frustration and annoyance being exhibited around what we attributed to be potentially lockout countermeasures or system unavailability. But when we explained the purpose of the lockout countermeasure to the whole sample, people overwhelmingly were in favor of having them equipped with this countermeasure. All our participants, or the vast majority, I should say, of our participants mentioned that they thought it was helpful to have the countermeasure of lockout equipped in their vehicles, and they also felt safer knowing that their vehicle was equipped with this last resort countermeasure to help them use the technology safely. So this brings us to the almost end of my talk, where we're talking now about the latest ratings program from the IIHS. This is a program I helped develop on safeguards for partial driving automation. And in this ratings program, we have 7 different components, but the first 3 components really do characterize the data that I presented today. First and foremost, the value and importance of having multimodal sensing solutions that really try to understand the activity happening behind the wheel and to make determinations with strong predictability with anticipating and predicting crash risk. So for example, certain types of distraction are very brief. And as the gentleman before me discussed, sometimes when you are very underloaded, we've seen time and time again, people will do short little distracting activities to maintain their cognitive arousal. That is not the type of distraction that we're targeting with this program. We're talking more about egregious distraction and making sure that partial automation systems that are equipped on the market have effective multimodal solutions to detect distraction, especially egregious distraction, in a variety of contexts, but also to have good, strong, empirically supported vehicle responses as a result. Attention reminders that have escalation sequences that use different modalities, especially in that escalation sequence for incremental addition to improve the chances of detection and response from the driver, as well as having these last resort countermeasures and that emergency escalation function. We've seen, I just showed you that there are some people who genuinely do need these last resort countermeasures in place. Most people, especially those people who are attentive, they'll never experience these last resort countermeasures. They'll even know that their vehicle's equipped with them. But there are some people who do exhaust the attention reminder sequence who need these last resort countermeasures in place. But clearly better communication around the lockout and how it relates to driver behavior and what the consequences are as well for shaping behavior needs to be explored. So that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.